Hello, today we're going to be talking about effects of low productivity growth, a really current issue and something that hasn't been tested on the Edexcel syllabus for quite some time. And so I feel that this is likely to come up in one form or another. Now, this question could come up as a reference to international competitiveness. It could come up in a supply side policy question. It could come up with reference to comparative advantage and trade, all sorts of areas where the real life data that we're going to talk about today would be really useful. So to start off, I'm going to show you what that real life data is. This is something from the recent Economics Factory video. Pause on that, have a look at that. Really useful data application. You can put in lots of essays. And then I've found two articles from the FT on the current state of the UK economy, and it doesn't make good reading. One is about the low government investment, reasons for low productivity, and this one is the effect of low productivity on the current account deficit, and that's our second point for the essay. So I'm going to show you both of them at the same time. You can pause and read each one in turn. Page 2, page 3, 4, 5, and finally 6. Now do go back through those and read really carefully. That's so useful as those articles. And do remember, you can get those on the FT if you just search for those, and that will work through the Wi-Fi connection at school. Right, pause the video now and then think about what are your 2 points going to be and what diagrams are you going to use. Okay, coming back. So firstly, this is a difficult essay because of the definitions you're going to need at the beginning. So productivity, output per worker, influenced by lots of things, but particularly what you wouldn't expect or wouldn't immediately expect would be the capital that workers are using. I suppose it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're using very advanced capital, the output per worker will be much higher. International competitiveness refers to the relative price and quality of a country's exports relative to other countries. So the important thing here is relative. And I suppose the question might have of low relative productivity growth. We've got to compare the productivity growth in the UK to other countries for it to be useful. And the international competitiveness relates to unit labour costs, or the average cost of labour per unit of output. Important pieces of knowledge for you to know in order to be able to start this essay off. My first point is going to be lower growth and higher inflation as an outcome. Please pause the video and try to make a logical chain of reasoning based on that, and think about what you can get from the texts to evaluate as well. Okay, so coming back, chain of reasoning is relatively straightforward, I think. So we've got, again, as always, the initial equilibrium. We've got the new equilibrium shifting to the results on YF, the full level of output of the economy, the price level, creating changes to growth and inflation. So low productivity growth, I've been very careful to say that that's relative to other countries. And it's quite a shocking statistic next to here that the USA has 49% higher output than the UK. And look at the UK down there on the G7 average. Very worrying. So we can see, first of all, that it is a very significant issue, which makes this question quite likely. Only 18% of GDP goes to investment, so low spending on health and education, and I'm using that health statistic there is worrying. But also look at the UK down here. As our percentage of GDP, you're seeing that very low level, one of the lowest in the G7 as a proportion of GDP. This is not G7, this is a select range of advanced economies. But even so, that's very low, isn't it? So you can remember that in any essay that you're talking about, vital context that is happening in the UK. Now, how do I make the LRES shift to the left? That's a bit of a difficult point. And what we can use is the idea of capital depreciation. The idea that capital, over time, gets worse in quality. It wears out. Roads get potholes in them, or whatever you want to talk about. And so low investments leads to the lower quality of roads, of health and education as that capital wears out, and we're not replacing it at a fast enough rate to keep up with the depreciation. Quality and quantity of capital is a component of LRAS, something that lots of people miss out. And so we're going to see a fall in potential output. I've linked back to higher unit labour costs here, so linking back to those key pieces of knowledge, and then higher rate of inflation in the long run and lower long run growth. To evaluate, well, there's not much to argue against that. I don't think it's really quite bleak, some of all of these policies that we're seeing here, but there are some points at the end of the article on the FT which suggest that there are things that the government are doing. So perhaps we can say that these points might mitigate some of the areas we've seen there. Do try and have a look at those and see what arguments you can get. Pause now. Come back. Right, so I'm arguing that, well, the government would say this, wouldn't it? 600 billion over the next 5 years, it might be mitigated by those policies. Nice word there, mitigated. Yeah, outweighed or counterbalanced by. We can point to a number of projects, HS2, Hinkley Point Nuclear Power Station, both of which are significantly delayed and huge cost overruns. £1 in every 6 is not spent by the UK government because of these delays. But anyway, we can still say that looking at it in a positive way, maybe they're planning these projects very well, and maybe that reduces the chances of government failure. I'm having to work really hard here to find something positive in all this. But actually, one thing that, I mean, if you talk to, say, Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, he would say, well, or Boris Johnson, they would say, well, Brexit may enable deregulation. It's a good point. Higher levels of FDI and domestic investment. If we lower those regulations, we see lower costs for firms and they're able to invest more. And we see what Kwasi Kwarteng was talking about, and Liz Truss, Britannia Unchained. A rosy view of the future, but maybe that does make sense. Right, point 2. Government current account deficit may worsen. That's our second point. Pause, come back, think about it. Right, so the current account deficit, I think this is a really nice point to make. You don't have a diagram for this, so that's why I've thought about using the diagram for the evaluation. So we've defined what the current account deficit is, and we've said that the lower productivity raises the unit labour costs for exporters. And you can refer back to international competitiveness in 2 ways. One is the quality of the exports. That's one of our areas of international competitiveness. The other is the quantity of exports due to the change in costs. So we can link back to, say, car exports to Europe from the UK. We know that car exporters are worried currently about the current state of the UK economy and may not invest here in the long run. And as a result, if we have higher costs and higher prices, lower quality, our export revenue, the UK's export revenue may fall. And that diagram over there on the other FT article is particularly damning when it's talking about the lowest export performance in the UK in the EU, and you can notice that is quite worrying there. Possibly issues relating to Brexit, I'm not sure, but certainly it is noticeable. So we could put that in as well. Inflows to the current account deficit, current account fall, do go back, because we've kind of wandered off on here talking about something else. Got to go back to the point that the current account deficit is widening. And again, if you want to link back to the article before, there we go, that widening there, the 0 there is the balanced current account. You can see in all of these, all of this period, we've got a significant current account deficit. So all very, very worrying. Right, exchange rate depreciation. Think about how you can use that diagram. I'm doing something strange here, and that is using a diagram in evaluation. So think about how you could use that diagram to challenge what we have just said above. Okay, coming back. So we are using this diagram here. We're using an exchange rate diagram and a fall in the demand for the pound. And that will result in lower inflows to the current account, reduced demand for the currency. According to research, productivity really does impact your currency. If your productivity falls, then you sell less to the rest of the world, and therefore the demand for your currency falls. That's the argument we're trying to make, quite a difficult one actually. And demand for the currency will shift to the left. Lower quality and higher priced exports, clearly people don't want that, in other countries don't want it, and that may well depreciate your currency. Now, the point here is, though, that it's an argument against, because export prices therefore fall. If we think about WIDEC, the weak pound will result in export prices being cheaper in other currencies, and therefore there is actually an improvement in international competitiveness. Depending on the elasticity of the UK exports, there would be an increase in the inflows to the current account, and the current account deficit would then become smaller. That, again, is a very positive, is really an argument that I don't particularly believe, but one which makes sense. And we'll put some of the further arguments into the conclusion, into the judgment. Now, judgment is a really nice one, and is one which I think we can sum up a lot of the problems for the UK economy. There are very, very significant causes for concern for the UK going forward in the next 10 years. Because the causes are long-run factors. Get this short-run, long-run into your argument. There may be short-run impacts on the UK, the pandemic. There may be short-run impacts on the UK's current account deficit. But the big long-run factors are all looking bad for the UK. Brexit is that the benefits don't seem to have hit yet. They may do, but clearly the first few years of Brexit is one of lack of confidence, low investment, and difficulties for exporters. Austerity since the 2008 recession going through the 2010s has resulted in low investment, and it may be that another government, a Labour government, may have a different view on that, but clearly those are going to be long-run issues that are going to take time to sort out. And planning laws and housing, things like this, are, again, long-run things which politically will be difficult to change. The low future growth, so I think we're probably looking at low future growth for the next 5 to 10 years, and that will make it difficult to fund supply-side policies. The UK needs significant supply-side policies, building of infrastructure, encouraging possibly industrial policies to encourage firms to come to the UK and set up big factories. That takes money, but that's a real issue because of the fact that the UK has high national debt, and therefore will struggle to fund it from borrowing, and it will also struggle to fund it from future tax revenue, which is likely to be lower than it should be due to the lower growth that we're probably going to see in the UK. Finally, the UK, and this is a very, very, very much more of a difficult point, but it would be great if you could put this in. I don't mind if you don't, but ultimately the UK has to now fund its current account deficits with inflows to the financial account. That might be through borrowing from the rest of the world, for example. It might be through inflows of direct investment and so on. But that ultimately means that the UK begins to essentially either sell some of its assets or borrow from the rest of the world. Now, this is only sustainable if your GDP is rising at a high enough rate so that your debt to GDP ratio is not rising. And if our trend growth is low due to low productivity, if we have lower tax revenue in the future, if our companies are not making the same level of profits that they would otherwise do, then this is a real issue. And therefore, I would really go for this judgment and say this is an incredibly particular cause for concern. We should, the UK should be changing some of its policies in order to ensure that this does not happen in the future. And another crisis means that the UK is particularly at risk if the rest of the world decides that it does not want to lend to it. So lots and lots of things to think about there, and I hope that you can take that essay and bend it into other questions as well, because there's lots of other questions which would be relevant to it. Okay, thank you for listening, and I hope that made sense.